In the years immediately following the Civil War, the railroad was king, and if the railroad was king, its prince was the conductor. The engineer might get to sit up front, blow the whistle, and drive the train, but he couldn't move that train a single inch until the conductor told him to. Joe Baldwin had always wanted to be a conductor, and one day he would finally realize his lifelong dream, when he was hired to be one for the Wilmington and Manchester line. Joe would appear at work every morning smartly dressed, with clean black pants, a starched white shirt, his black leather vest, and an expertly tied bow tie. On the top of his head, he proudly wore his conductor's hat with a medallion on the front that said just that. He always carried his lantern with him, along with a ticket punch and, of course, his railroad watch, for it was with that watch that Joe made sure his train ran on time. As I'm sure you could tell by now, Joe took very good care of his trains. Several times during a run, Joe would walk from one end to the other, checking everything he could think of. He would check the wheels to see if any foreign objects had gotten into them. He would check the boxcars to make sure they were properly locked. He would even make sure there was constantly enough oil for the lamps, so they wouldn't burn out during a night run. One stormy night, traveling through the swampy woods of Maco, North Carolina, Joe was back in his caboose, resting. He had just completed his rounds and was taking a short break as the train was rapidly approaching South Carolina. Joe was excited to reach Charleston, as this was a town he would frequent and enjoyed very much. Dreams of Charleston would dance in his head, as the clickety-clack of the track would lull him to sleep, when quite abruptly he would notice the train slowing down. Joe instinctively woke up in a flash. He was immediately worried, knowing it wasn't time to stop yet. He jumped up, ran for the front of the caboose, opened up the door, and tried to step out to the next coach. To Joe's horror, there was no coach to step onto. The caboose he was riding in somehow became disconnected from the rest of the train. Somewhere in the distant darkness, his beloved train had left him behind. Joe knew he was in trouble. Right behind his train was a fast freight. With at least Joe now stopped, there was no way it wasn't quickly approaching. Peering through the rain and fog, Joe stood on the rear landing. Before long, in the distance, he would see a pinpoint of light, and he knew it had to be the fast freight. Joe grabbed his lantern and started waving it frantically. He would scream for the engineer, begging for him to stop. The engineer couldn't hear him, and Joe knew this, but he screamed anyway. As the freight's light grew bigger and bigger, Joe heard the whooshing sound of air brakes, then the sound of the freight locomotive going into reverse, its wheels spinning on the track. Sparks flew from either side like a terrifying fireworks display, and that display would be the last thing Joe Baldwin ever saw. With a deafening crash, the freight smashed into his caboose. Save for the steam coming from the freight locomotive, on the track there was a silence. The only light coming from Joe's lamp, which had been thrown deep into the dark swamp. It would burn through the night, and the next morning people came to survey the wreckage. Near the caboose was Joe's mangled body. To the horror of onlookers, at some point during the crash he was decapitated, and despite their best efforts of searching, were never able to find such. Only the lantern he kept by his side, which was still warm to the touch. They carried Joe home and buried him without his head. Only weeks later, however, another stormy night like the one before would appear again. The station master at Maco stepped out onto the platform. As he peered down the tracks, he thought he saw a pinpoint of light approaching the station. But this couldn't be right. He checked his watch, and no train was supposed to be arriving now. The light continued slowly down the tracks, almost as if it was someone with a lantern. Then it started to swing, back and forth, slowly at first, but as it got closer to the station, it got wider. It would grow, become more frantic, and as quickly as it appeared, disappeared again into the night. Of course, the station master didn't know what to think of this, so eventually he dismissed it from his mind. Eventually, however, the light would come back, mainly on nights with stormy weather, but again more and more. And just like before, it would start at a tiny point, growing larger as it approached, swinging back and forth like a lantern, wilder and wilder, and then, as it neared the station, would disappear and go back into the woods. The station master wasn't the only one to see this light either. Engineers that approached Maco saw it along the tracks, and would then stop thinking they saw a signal. It became so common they had to make a special rule at Maco, where any signal to any train was done with 2 lights instead of 1. With any single lights to be ignored. People would come from all over to try to see what they called the Maco light. Scientists would even try studying such to try to come up with a plausible theory, but never could figure it out. Some claimed it to be a ball of lightning or even swamp gas. In later years, some even said it was automobile headlights reflecting from the tracks. Locals, however, had a different theory. They thought it was Joe Baldwin coming to find his head. Sadly, however, he would never have the chance. In 1977, the railroad shut down, and the line and all of its tracks were tore up. When the tracks left, so too did the light, and it hasn't appeared since. Whether Joe Baldwin found his head, or maybe some other measure of peace, that was the last anyone ever saw of his light. Though even now, the legend of the Maco light puts fear in conductors' hearts everywhere.